So my name is Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation, and we are your physical hosts today. So welcome to our offices and welcome to our building. When you talk about civil asset forfeiture, or at least when I talk about civil asset forfeiture, the main reaction I get from people is disbelief. They can't believe that's going on in this country. People say that cannot possibly be legal. They cannot possibly be able to do that. But yet it's going on, and it's going on in Texas, and it's going on in states around the country. For those of us who support reform of civil asset forfeiture and other justice issues, it's not a matter of not supporting law enforcement. It's not a matter of not being in favor of law and order. In fact, we do it precisely because we're in favor of law and order. We do it precisely because we believe that true justice and true law and order is achieved by following the Constitution, by following the Fourth Amendment, by respecting individual civil rights and property rights. And so when the criminal gets on the wrong side of law and order, when the criminal gets on the wrong side of the Constitution, then we throw the book at them. But when law enforcement finds itself through mission creep and other reasons on the wrong side of the Constitution, well, we have a problem with that too, and we need to address that too. So hopefully today we can begin building some support and some understanding here in Texas and also around the country that will allow for us to achieve some reforms of some of these abuses so that we can eliminate some of these abuses. We're doing two panels today. I'll introduce the moderator of the first panel, then we'll have a short break, and then we'll be doing a second panel. But don't leave early if you can help it, because after the second panel we'll be doing a reception. We will feed you. We will give you beverages, and in fact we've got TVs out in the lobby, and you could even hang around and watch some of the election returns coming in from New Hampshire while enjoying each other's company. So thanks once again for being here. We are live streaming this over the internet, so thank you to those of you who are not lucky enough to be with us here in Texas today. We're glad to have you with us as well. If you're on social media, we have a hashtag that we're using for today's event, and it is CAF Summit. CAF for Civil Asset Forfeiture, and then Summit. So if you're tweeting or whatever you're doing on social media, please do use that hashtag. Let me now introduce the moderator of our first panel. The first panel's topic is When Innocence Does Not Help, How to Communicate About Civil Asset Forfeiture. And it'll be moderated by Dan Isett. Dan is the Communications Director of Right on Crime and the Center for Effective Justice at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Prior to joining TPPF, Dan was Director of Communications and Policy for the Parents Television Council and Director of External Affairs at the Center for Education Reform. So please welcome Dan in our first panel.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tom, for that warm and generous introduction. I commend all of you for being here in Texas today, and for those watching on the internet. It's a beautiful day outside, but as it always is here in Texas, right? But I commend you for being here today to talk about this really key issue that is such a threat to our liberty, a threat to our property, and today we're going to, in this first panel, the idea is really to sort of learn how to communicate about these things. How, when Tom asked earlier who all was aware of this issue, and probably 3/4 of the room had a hand up. I guarantee you that if we leave this room right now, the public at large has very little idea what's at stake in this issue, what goes on to that, until such a time as they've had an asset forfeited and haven't been accused or convicted of a crime. So that's what's really at stake here, and like I said, I commend you for being here. I'm really excited about this first panel. We've got some terrific folks here, and just a quick overview of who these folks are, a little bit of background, and then we'll get right into it. And I do really want to leave a good bit of time for some interaction with you guys, from questions from our audience, from questions for social media if there are any out there, and we'll go ahead and get started. But immediately to my left is my good friend, Representative Matt Schaefer, who currently represents District 6, which is that entirely in Smith County?
Yes.
Entirely in Smith County, just about 85 miles east of here, in beautiful Tyler, Texas. Matt is an avid proponent of civil asset forfeiture reform. In fact, he sponsored legislation in the last legislative session here in Texas that would address just that. He's assigned to the Defense and Veterans Affairs Committee and the Urban Affairs Committee as well. Matt also attended Cisco Junior College, where he played football. You can tell by his svelte appearance. And then attended Texas Tech, which is my alma mater, so guns up there. And it got both his undergraduate and his law degree at Texas Tech. So please welcome Representative Schaefer. Also with us is Jason Pye, who is the Director of Communications and the Director of Justice Reform at the illustrious organization FreedomWorks, our proud partners on these and many initiatives. And I love his bio. I love reading this too, by the way. And I'm going to read it word for word just so you'll really get the flavor for it. When Jason's not fighting for the cause of liberty, he enjoys listening to punk rock, playing his guitars, watching baseball, and dreaming of the day that the University of Georgia football team brings home a national championship.
All of that is accurate.
So good luck with that. Yeah. That's all I can say to that. And then lastly, but certainly not least, is our good friend Matt Simpson of the ACLU of Texas, where he serves as a policy strategist since 2008. Matt advocates for civil rights and civil liberties at the state legislatures and assists with local campaigns related to criminal justice reform, such as prison and jail policy, law enforcement, information sharing, and ending the the school to prison pipeline. After attending Baylor University, any Baylor grads out there? There we go. We got one. He went on to Lewis and Clark Law School, and his interest in criminal justice reform and police accountability is what really brings him to the table at ACLU. So please welcome the rest of the panel, and we'll go ahead and get started. So a couple of broad stroke questions to kind of get the discussion started today. We're really trying to think more precisely about how to communicate these issues to the public at large. So let's get started in sort of broad strokes, and I'll direct it to Jason to start with, and we'll kind of move on from there. But this is really one of those issues, as you can tell by this panel, that really cuts that left-right divide. It's one of those few things where people of goodwill really have a lot of interest in a particular issue and to want to see it reformed. So from your perspective and that at FreedomWorks, what do you think that the public doesn't understand about this issue?
Well, I think the public doesn't understand that the serious civil liberty violations that occur with this. I mean, I think and somebody was pointing this out a second ago, you talk to ordinary people and they think that this is something that happens in a totalitarian regime. Our activists, we explain what civil asset forfeiture is, and we explain how it's connected to the Fifth Amendment, how it's connected to due process, how it's even connected to the Fourth Amendment through illegal searches and seizures. And they're appalled by it. And I think you're certainly right in terms of the left-right connection. I mean, shortly after joining FreedomWorks, Matt Kibbe, who was then the president and CEO of FreedomWorks, and Joan Blades from MoveOn.org wrote 2 op-eds about civil asset forfeiture in complete agreement. These are 2 people who would never ordinarily come together over anything. I mean, or they would usually fight like cats and dogs. More recently, you have organizations like the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Sakira Cook, who's one of their policy analysts over there. Her and I have bonded over this issue specifically many times. And I think that we've learned how to sell it in a certain way. We frame it as a civil liberties issue. We frame it as a constitutional issue. And that's how you connect with people on it.
Again, and same question to you, Matt. From a more center-left perspective, how would you approach this issue?
Well, I think, I started Googling some of the, ACLU's been involved in a number of these cases and litigation, and so I thought it would be interesting to kind of see how that's been covered as we look at the question of how to communicate this. And I noticed a lot of the headlines are something along the lines of, Heritage Foundation and ACLU agree. Like, it doesn't actually get into the subject matter of what we agree on. And so, in a way, I think like kind of my presence here and the fact that FreedomWorks is a national partner on all this, that strategy seems to catch the interest of people. It's a good starting point. I think it maybe indicates that underneath it all, asset forfeiture is something that impacts everybody kind of regardless of political stripe. And there's something there for almost anybody to get upset about. And in some ways, it's just the lack of freedom, the liberty violating nature of just taking somebody's stuff without any real opportunity in court to fight that, or without an appropriate opportunity. I think it really, at its bottom, almost anybody in the United States has a problem with that. And so, in a way, I think that we do a great service to our communications just by starting from this left-right partnership or across the spectrum partnership, because it reminds people there's something to this that's really far beyond the politics of it all, that there's something very personal that we should be paying attention to.
Well, obviously, we completely agree with you, and that's really a lot of what brings us to the table. And going to you, Representative Schaefer, I mean, legislative bodies are supposed to represent, all the people in the state. So, when we talk about legislation in particular, what the dynamics are, particularly here in Texas, but how do you think a legislator approaches this that might be different from us communication hacks?
Stop talking about civil asset forfeiture. Start talking about property rights in conjunction with criminal charges. Property rights are something that a lot of conservative Republicans talk about and care about, and I think every citizen cares about property rights. Property rights were central to the American Revolution. We didn't like what King George was doing, kicking in doors and seizing property and doing things he shouldn't do. When you start talking about civil asset forfeiture, that's lawyer talk. It's insider language, and from my experience knocking on thousands of doors in the district, you don't tell people you're Matt Schaefer running for state representative from District 6. They don't know what a state representative is often. So you just say, I'm Matt Schaefer and I'm running to represent you down in Austin. So speak in language that they understand. They understand property rights, they understand criminal charges, which is different than a conviction. And they also understand that the word forfeiture is sort of kind of dark word. So if someone has been involved in a civil asset forfeiture, even the word forfeiture seems to bring to mind that somebody must have done something wrong. But, citizens are afforded the presumption of innocence in a criminal court. And so why don't we just start with, we're all citizens, we all have the presumption of innocence, and we're dealing with property rights in conjunction with criminal charges.
We've got a lot of Texans here today, obviously, but the focus on this is really meant to be, national in scope. There are a number of states that have addressed this issue legislatively, and a number that hope to here in the near future, here over the course of the spring in particular. So Jason, can you get us up to speed on sort of what's going on nationally in terms of reform of this?
Sure. Well, just last year we had New Mexico, which passed a civil asset forfeiture law that is really the gold standard in civil asset forfeiture. It not only prohibits forfeiture without a criminal conviction, but it actually prohibits law enforcement from sending assets to the federal government to be forfeited through the federal process, the federal forfeiture laws. So in that bill, it passed unanimously through both chambers of the state legislature. The House, which was controlled by Republicans, the Senate controlled by Democrats, and signed into law literally at the last minute by Governor Susana Martinez. Now, I'm proud to say FreedomWorks drove 5,000 calls to Governor Martinez's office, and a little humble brag. But I think the representative is right. You have to frame it as a property rights issue, and not to tie this to presidential politics, and I hate to do that and hijack your event. Sorry, not sorry. But no, I think if you look at some of the attacks that have been happening on the presidential race, property rights, it really rings true with people, with voters, with your constituents. Donald Trump fell in the polls in Iowa for a reason. Is because the attacks on him on eminent domain worked. Civil asset forfeiture is ostensibly eminent domain. It's just a different type of eminent domain. And you can read more about Donald Trump's stuff on civil.
But at least with eminent domain in Texas, the entity that's trying to assert it has the burden of proof, actually prove that they have the authority to do it at the get-go.
Yeah, and that's kind of. That's another way we've sold it to our activists. And I don't think we would have gotten 5,000 phone calls to Governor Martinez's office if we hadn't have framed it as a property rights issue. That's how we framed it in other states that we've worked in as well. And we've seen high rates of return in terms of engaging in phone calls or email blasts, whatever it is, in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan, where Michigan passed a civil asset forfeiture law. It was not as good as New Mexico's, not as strong as we would have liked for it to be. It didn't require a criminal conviction, but it certainly raised the standard of evidence to clear and convincing, which is the highest standard of proof in civil court. Montana passed a civil asset forfeiture law that requires a criminal conviction. Again, not as comprehensive as New Mexico because New Mexico's was so far-reaching. But we're seeing this legislature alone. We have civil asset forfeiture bills, obviously, in Texas. We have one in Georgia that is the shortest bill I have ever seen. It's literally 1 page long, and all it does is strike one sentence and then require a judge to stay a forfeiture until there's a criminal conviction. So we're seeing a lot of movement in legislatures already this early in the year, and we saw it late last year, and we're hoping it carries over, and we continue the momentum we had from New Mexico and Montana into the 2016 legislative sessions.
I think that was a pretty good overview. Was there anything that you feel like was missing from all of that?
Well, I might just build on it a little bit. So I spoke with our New Mexico affiliate. I'm obviously here in Texas, but we've got folks all over the country, and they highlighted a couple of things that they thought were particularly important in terms of this bill moving forward and kind of the communications, the messaging of it. The first was that they felt like it was really critical that the bill would abolish civil asset forfeiture altogether. They felt like that the bill would not have passed had it been a change in standard like Michigan is seeking. And I thought that was interesting. I mean, I think, at least from my side, watching the legislature work, you always assume that a less comprehensive bill might have a little easier time passing because it'd be more of a compromise. And it sounded like, from their perspective, just going for the whole thing, it really gave it more power. I think in some ways maybe that allows you to talk about the underlying problems with this practice, as opposed to saying something about that gets more into the details of, well, we have to change these standards. Second, I think they felt like the national and in-state attention on the issue of forfeiture was critical. There had been litigation just prior to the legislative session, and so that the kind of the bad examples that came out, the incidents of people that really had done nothing wrong getting a large amount of money taken from them by law enforcement with really no recourse. It seemed to have struck a chord in New Mexico, and I think the national kind of sometimes can even be an echo chamber to some degree, but the national coverage of what was happening in New Mexico really then pushed New Mexico to take more action. The real life stories were important. I think one of the most important parts of communicating this, and I can say this was even our experience here in Texas. The ACLU of Texas sued in Tenaha over some practices in 2008 or 9. And having the stories of the individuals that were impacted by this put a fine point on it. It was important to talk about a man whose son was with him, and when his assets were forfeited, his child was also taken to foster care for a short time. Those kind of stories are horrifying, and we should be up in arms about them, and I think it's a good reminder. Finally, they identified there was somebody from the Justice Department, formerly in the Reagan administration, that lived in New Mexico at the time this bill was going through, named Brad Cates. And he was able to kind of provide I would say like the prosecutor and law enforcement counterpoint. He was able to say, well, I was actually around when we first started doing this. 1984 was when the federal government really expanded asset forfeiture the way we know it today. So he was an official at the time that this was really being expanded. At the time he thought it made sense. He was able to go to New Mexico and the legislators there and say this was a mistake. We need to reel this back in.
Well, as it happens, Brad Cates is here with us today,
Okay.
and you'll hear from him here in the second panel. So
Maybe obviously I haven't met him yet.
Yeah,
let's
so we'll.
look forward to it.
Hi, Brad's right over there. So we'll get you fixed up on that. So what do you think? How do you think Texas fits into this equation, then, Representative Schaefer? I mean, we're awfully proud here in Texas of leading the way nationally, but we really haven't on this. We've had some roadblocks and that sort of thing. What do you think the lay of the land is in terms of Texas continuing to lead on this issue?
So the common fear, I think, often unstated but very real for a guy in my position, is when you look at how much money is involved in civil asset forfeiture. I mean, just this past year alone in the border region, $28 million in currency, just currency. It's a lot of money. We have some departments that are getting more money in asset forfeiture revenue than they are from their appropriated budgets. I mean, it's in some cases it's a huge percentage of their overall budget. So couple that with law enforcement dealing with a lot of the negative media that they've dealt with. There's sort of this idea that they're under attack or they're beleaguered. And it makes this a very difficult conversation. Now, to me, when you restore a good standard, and to me, you go back to up to 1989 in Texas, it was beyond a reasonable doubt. That was the standard for civil asset forfeiture in Texas, and it dealt with drugs and gambling. And when it got expanded, it lowered that. But to me, if we would raise the standard on this issue it would actually improve attitudes about law enforcement. I think those of us that do support law enforcement and are very sympathetic to how difficult their job is, you want them to have as much faith and confidence from the public as you can get. And to me, every time you have somebody on the margins who's runs into this statute and maybe was being wronged, or they were the innocent property owner, and they run into this statute, they develop a grievance against law enforcement. And we don't want that. We want there to be a high standard. But I can tell you that procedurally it's very difficult. So for instance, I filed a bill based off Justice Willett's dissent where there was an innocent property owner, okay? So I sold my truck to Dan and he's making payments to me. Dan gets involved in some illegal activity. The truck gets seized. I find out about it and everybody knows that I own the truck and I wasn't actually even not charged. Nobody even says that I was. But then I find out that to get my truck back, the burden, the innocent property owner, is on me to prove that I wasn't involved. And that went all the way up to the Texas Supreme Court and it didn't come out favorably. So I filed a bill just to fix that narrow aspect of it. And there were other bills filed, but even that bill was opposed by district attorneys in some jurisdictions. And you realize that that tiny bill, if it was to leave committee, and it got out of committee very late when they knew it wouldn't go anywhere, if that bill was to get to the House floor, it opens it up, it's germane, and all of a sudden anybody who wants to really address the larger issues about civil asset forfeiture, property rights, is going to put an amendment on there and it's going to be germane, and all of a sudden we're going to be taking votes on the House floor that many in the law enforcement community don't agree with. And there are organizations that will just smear you when you get back home to your district and say that you are anti-law enforcement. That happens. It's happened to me, it's happened to my colleagues, it's real. And you look at all the fights that we get invited to. We get invited to a lot of fights as legislators. We just say, some of them just say, well, that's just one I'm not going to. And that pretty much sums it up. I don't know.
You kind of stole the next question I was going to sort of ask to the panel, and I really want all y'all to comment on this. All y'all is a Texas term, by the way, just so you know.
I'm from the South.
There you go. All y'all. So, you know, if we had some members of law enforcement here today or the prosecutor community, you know, they would say this is a key aspect of how we generate extra revenue. It pays for our overtime. It does lots of great things for the community. It keeps drug dealers from keeping all the benefits of their crimes, you know, all of these litany of great things. So why are they wrong?
I mean, there are instances in which, and I'm going to refer to my notes here, but there are instances in which, and it's true, some law enforcement may use this in a quote-unquote honest way. And at FreedomWorks, we've taken great pain not to beat up on law enforcement too much on this, because at the end of the day, lawmakers are the ones who wrote the laws. Sorry, it's just true. And they're the ones who have to fix them. But law enforcement do fight back. But you have situations like in Tennessee. Along the I-40 corridor, police are 10 times more likely to stop cars traveling in westbound lanes, which carry cash, than cars going on the eastbound lane, which carry drugs to Nashville. That's not stopping drug dealers and offenders. That's going where the money is. And there's another example in Florida. Let's see. Police along the I-95 corridor in Florida, where drugs were shipped north, are more likely to stop cars traveling south. Again, if you're going after the criminals, why aren't you going where they're actually coming from instead of going after the money? So I think, I try not to beat up on law enforcement too much, but you look at some of the stuff the money's spent on. You have a sheriff in Georgia spent $90,000 from forfeiture funds on a Dodge Viper for his county's drug awareness program. And he also spent $35,000 to build a party house, whatever that is. A prosecutor in Texas, $267,000 on travel expenses, which included trips to casinos. Whether those were for a legitimate purpose or not is anybody's guess. Another Texas prosecutor purchased booze and a margarita machine. Actually, it was a Jimmy Buffett margarita machine. How many of you guys have seen the special? Which show was it? It was HBO. John Oliver. You've seen the John Oliver special where they did the Special Victims Unit. Law and Order actually had Jeff Goldblum. They actually mocked that one, and they had him making margaritas. Atlanta prosecutor used forfeiture funds to rent out a movie theater just 3 months before mandating 10 furlough days for employees due to budget shortfalls. He also used forfeiture funds to pay for home security for his own personal home, register an office softball team. He paid for a photo shoot, dinners, and tickets to see singer and rapper CeeLo Green. Those are not legitimate uses of forfeiture funds to protect the public. Those are, in many cases, for personal enrichment or for personal pleasure. I'm not saying again that some law enforcement doesn't use them in the way that they were intended to be used, but many of them don't.
Can we stop and just talk about what's the right standard? And then as lawmakers, let's say, okay, we need to run our law enforcement function. Let's make sure that we have the right money for them to do that.
Yeah.
Let's set the standard where it should be that lines up with our sense of justice. And then I think we can deal with the fact that it is an incentive in some cases. And I think you have to acknowledge that. I mean, we purchased a plane to do border security with this money. That's a very legitimate law enforcement purpose. And so how do you acknowledge the mess that's been made by giving departments a way to really become dependent upon this revenue source legally, telling them this is perfectly acceptable, but then you want to change the standard. Now see, when I look at a prosecutor's office and say, well, what is your success rate on getting convictions? Well, it's very high. It's no doubt in the 90th percentile for virtually every district attorney. And seldom is someone acquitted, and sometimes charges are dismissed. So the idea that you can't still seize property and have some for your use, I think is not really true, because I guarantee you a lot of those guys that are walking around with big bundles of cash coming up from the border are going to get convicted. And so that money is going to be there, but maybe we need to find a way to adjust the legal standard and sort of then as policymakers take on the responsibility to make sure that the departments can still do their job the way that we as the public expect them to do it.
I'll just quickly, I think we might have a question, but I'll quickly, in Pennsylvania, the ACLU of Pennsylvania was involved in some in legislation there, and one of the things that they were really careful about, and I think we probably all should take this as note, is that it wasn't about blaming law enforcement. Essentially, they really tried to make the argument that you can put in place essentially a conviction requirement for a seizure, but it doesn't actually change police practice that much. And so the idea is that you can seize something, like you arrest somebody, you're probably going to seize more than you are going to ever keep. And then once the court process unfolds, then if there's no conviction, the person should be able to just get their stuff back. That's a really simplified version of it. But being able to say, look, you'll still be able to seize everything, and then the court process takes over, as opposed to law enforcement seizes it, and then they're just sort of at their own discretion to do whatever they like with it. Those are two very different proposals, but in reality, they don't really result in a whole lot of changes on the ground. And I think that was a really important point in Pennsylvania, was to say, we're not taking away your ability to seize things, you just don't get to keep it without a conviction.
And I don't know of any Texas legislator that wants to take away this as a tool for convicted criminals. I haven't met one. So, I'd like to get beyond that.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, in Georgia, where I'm from, you look at, last year they passed a civil asset forfeiture reform law. It was sponsored by House Judiciary Committee Chairman Wendell Willard. And it was very modest. I mean, it heightened some transparency requirements, but it didn't really change the burden of proof or the evidentiary standard or anything substantive like that. Didn't take away the profit motive. They didn't go after it. My understanding from talking to legislators, including the legislator who's introduced the new bill this session, is that the Georgia Sheriff's Association actually brought in a bunch of deputies, a bunch of sheriffs, a bunch of employees, and they were all filling the House gallery at the time they passed the bill, and they were just sitting there staring at each lawmaker, just like, don't you ever think about doing anything more than this. And for them, I mean, and I think the representative's right. I mean, we have to go after the evidentiary standard. We have to address that. We have to address how the procedures are carried out, but we have to address the profit motive in a way that, because at the end of the day, law enforcement, state or local, should be funded by those respective agencies, those respective governments, not off the backs of people who are having their property essentially stolen from them, in many instances.
And if I could just quickly, that was another, in Pennsylvania, they did a study, and, when they started looking at how much money was involved, many of the, these
$200 and $300.
Right, it was $192. The bottom half, the average amount of seizure was $192 in cash. That's not reducing the impact of organized crime. That is just kind of an arbitrary tax.
And it tended to hit minority neighborhoods more than
Absolutely
anybody else.
I would take issue with saying that the money is being stolen. One, that implies what they're doing is illegal. It's not illegal. It's clearly within the law that we put in place. Are there cases where it's abused and someone who's innocent has their property taken and just doesn't have the means to recover it? Yes. And are there cases where, every jurisdiction you see, sometimes someone gets hit with a charge that's just shouldn't be there? Yes, that's the case. But if we are going to communicate about this, we do have to acknowledge that it is a legitimate law enforcement tool when used properly, and that they are following the law. But then if there's a problem with the law, it's incumbent upon us as citizens to decide whether it needs to be changed or not.
And I've got two more quick questions, and then we'll go ahead and open it up to the audience for that. And they're very similar. The first one is, what are we doing right on this issue, both from a center-left perspective and from a conservative perspective?
I think telling the story. You have stories like Charles Clark, who was a young man who was in the Kentucky airport right outside Cincinnati, had his life savings on it. He was on a prolonged stay with his family in Cincinnati. After, I think, 3 or 4 months, something along that line, he was leaving, and apparently the ticket taker at the gate said his bag smelled like marijuana. He had local law enforcement come up to him, asked to search his bag. He had, I think, $11,000 or $12,000 in cash. They seized the cash, and he's now fighting through, I think, the Institute for Justice is his counsel in that case. Another one is Joseph Rivers, a young man who was traveling from his home near Dearborn, Michigan to Los Angeles with the hopes of making it in the music business. He had $16,000 in cash on him. It was the life savings. His family helped him save it up. He worked hard for that money. When he boarded DEA agents boarded the train in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Again, we've talked about New Mexico, but this was a federal forfeiture, not a state forfeiture. It's completely different. DEA agents found the money. He told him the story. He called his mother. He had his mother corroborate his story that he was going to LA to get involved in the music business. They still took his cash. And the DEA agent, actually the local representative, the local communications person for the DEA, when asked about the criminal convictions, they said, look, the money is guilty. The person's not on trial here. It's the money that's guilty. We don't have to charge them with a crime. It just shows the kind of we're prosecuting inanimate objects. That's what forfeiture is. So telling the stories is the most powerful tool we have. And actually was at a Right on Crime event in Washington, D.C., had the opportunity to hear Joseph Rivers talk about his experience. And that kid he learned a lot about forfeiture in just a few months, and unfortunately because of the circumstances.
Most people forget that Texas in 2011 actually passed the beginnings of a reform bill. Senator Whitmire had a bill that tried to, first of all, it was sort of in response to the Tinaha litigation. It made it so that you couldn't literally sign away your assets with no process on the side of the road. It's hard to believe we had to take that step, but prior to that, you could sign away a waiver that literally you had no opportunity to appeal after that. So that practice has been ended by state law in Texas in 2011. And then there was an attempt to kind of address some of the uses, because Texas was the Jimmy Buffett margarita machine state. And so, obviously, everybody wanted to at least address that part.
Some say that's legitimate use.
Well, actually, I would be willing to have that conversation. But the big picture is we've started on that path to some degree before. Certainly, plenty of people have filed the bills. So I think what we've done right is start to get our trajectory figured out, start to think about where we're headed, and it's not where we're at. We need to be somewhere else, and I think that we can say Texas has done.
One thing I want to add is I've seen lawmakers introduce legislation without spending any time on an education process of why they're doing it and what they're doing and why this is needed, and within hours or a couple of days of introducing the legislation, they just get pummeled by law enforcement. There's a state senator from a state in this region who's experiencing that right now, unfortunately. And the law enforcement is saying some very vicious things about what his bill would do, completely hyperbolic things. But we need to, before lawmakers go into introducing legislation they need to have the education process. They need to explain to their fellow lawmakers, their colleagues in the State House or State Senate, explain what they're doing, explain to law enforcement to the best they can why they're doing what they're doing, and also talk to their constituents, because I mean, ultimately, if your constituents have your back, you're in safe territory. So those things are another thing that's needed.
So what are we doing right here, Representative Schaefer?
We're talking about it. That's a start. Everything I'm being saying is recording and being put into a mailer for my next election, I'm sure. You know, there's some new reporting requirements that's going to start in Texas. I know that my office is tracking some of that. Some of those reports are coming in, so we're actually getting our handle around how much money we're talking about. Look, we voted some bills out of committee in criminal jurisprudence, so we know there's some yes votes there, right? So that's a start. But really, we need more people engaged, and the Republican Party is the worst on this. We really are. We just have, you know, we're not seen as the party of civil liberties anymore, and that's wrong. And I hope to be a part of a liberty-minded group of Republicans that change that perception, because I do believe in the Fourth Amendment, and I do support law enforcement. I can do both. You know, hey, I volunteered to go to Afghanistan. I love my country, and I care about safety, and I care about rule of law. But I've seen up close and personal parts of the world where law is completely ignored, and it's a place run by men and not by laws. And we need laws that are blind to how much money is coming into the department. And I think that's the goal.
Well, I'm glad you teed that up, because this is really my last question for the panel, and we'll move on to what the audience has to ask for you. But you know, and you sort of teed this up, I think, pretty well. Is it particularly on the conservative side, and it's true on the left-leaning side as well, but particularly conservatives have kind of a default position that they sort of genetically want to support law enforcement and whatever it's doing, and that's, you know, by and large a good thing. But that doesn't mean that the laws that they're trying to enforce all the time are always precisely where they need to be. And that's kind of the needle that has to be threaded on the messaging. You know, this is supposed to be, you know, more communications, less of a policy thing. And that's been our challenge from the beginning on this issue is how do you communicate, particularly to a conservative audience? And feel free to chime in on this too. But how do you get at that particular issue?
One thing I often start out with, I think it was the end of last year, I had the opportunity to participate in a panel hosted. I had to participate through the internet because I didn't want to fly out to Oklahoma City. For one day, it didn't make much sense. But no, I had the opportunity to participate in this panel discussion on civil asset forfeiture. And it was around the time, it was actually September, I remember, because I had written out some notes, and it was around the time my dad died, September 7th, 1993. And it was around the time that he died, it was like the 22nd anniversary of his death. And my dad was a cop. My dad was a police officer. He served in Forest Park Police Department, which is a bedroom community just south of Atlanta. He served for the Atlanta Police Department. I think he was a police officer for about 10, 12 years, something along that line, until he had to retire because of, he was a Vietnam vet in addition to being a police officer, and he was exposed to Agent Orange, and he got to the point where he couldn't work anymore. So I always talk about my dad and his law enforcement experiences. I realized I used the word steal earlier. That's how I view it. I am a libertarian after all, but I have the utmost respect for law enforcement because many people in my family have been law enforcement. My father was a police officer. Friends are police officers. I think, and even like in some of the things that have happened on the national stage in Ferguson, in Baltimore, in New York. I mean, you can have sympathy toward those communities and still have respect of law enforcement, even though, regardless of your belief, you can still do those things. You don't have to pick one side or the other. You can see right and wrong on both sides, or at least understand the arguments. And so that's kind of how I talk to conservatives about it with our activists. We had 50 activists in our office last June, and I talked about forfeiture to them, and again, go back through some of the things where I talked about it as a property rights issue, talked about it as a constitutional issue, and just made it very clear, like, look, this is not us beating up on police. This is, it's a lawmaker problem. It's lawmakers have given them this tool, whether it's legitimate or not, they have given it to them. But we had activists leaving and writing. They were emailing their lawmakers, on their state representatives or state senators on their phones while we had people talking still, and saying, "Please introduce civil asset forfeiture reform legislation." I remember having to run upstairs and grab about 25 copies of IJ's model legislation for civil asset forfeiture.
That's very powerful because I never had anybody when I first ran for office talk to me about this. No one.
I mean, that's why FreedomWorks exists. We want to be a service center to our activists, and this is one of our issues. We're involved in this project for a reason. It's the constitutional issue, it's the property rights issue, because after all, property rights are the essential economic liberty.
I don't think I have too much to add to that, but I would say, maybe just in my relatively limited experience here, I think sometimes you just have to start at the beginning and you have to explain it very simply. I think your point previously is a very good one, that if you walk in the door and you're like, we need to reform civil asset forfeiture, that's like 3 words. Nobody totally understands how they all fit together in first blush. And so, I think you kind of have to say, like, maybe you want to avoid words that are a little loaded, like stolen, although, who knows. But there are simpler ways to talk about this, and there's simple solutions. And I think we want to make sure that as we communicate, this is a property issue, this is a constitutional issue, and the fix is actually fairly straightforward. Those are all things that are important for people to hear from us.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for that panel. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and open it up to the audience. I think Michael Haugen from our staff has a microphone, so if we'll get that to you, and start with the gentleman here on the second row. He's the first one up.
Well, first I want to make the point, my brother is a chief of police and a good one, and frankly, he thinks civil asset forfeiture is out of hand. He wouldn't disagree with any of the points that were made. Now, that said, the representative is exactly right. The people don't have any idea what you're talking about. I belong to the Downtown Rotary Club in Dallas, and back in the 80s when we had 200 and some people at a meeting, all the civic leaders, the FBI, and the SAC was a friend of all of ours, and the local chief came over and they made this big deal about civil asset forfeiture and how it was taking the assets used in committing crimes and putting that money to work productively to help, police and prosecution. You know what? We all thought that was great. Now, I never thought about it again, except they'd come back once a year and talk about how much money had gone back to, to help law enforcement. And it was probably not out of hand then. I didn't think about it again until I was running a company in Jacksonville, Florida. I had branches all over Georgia and Florida. And my Valdosta branch, the people started talking in Georgia, people started talking about the local sheriff who was picking off high-dollar cars from the Northeast as they went by and planting stuff on them, seizing the cars. Well, then another guy further on down in Florida started doing the same thing, and I thought, how can this be? And that's when my consciousness was raised. But before that, I thought this was just a great program. Now, the other thing is, what you're really doing is you're giving a volume-based commission to the people who have all of the weapons and power and saying, go out and get as much as you can. And how well did that work here in Dallas County? The constables came in Dallas County to the county commission. They said, we're all certified law enforcement, and so why don't you let us do traffic enforcement and stuff? We're tired of just serving process, okay? And the county commission said, oh, we can't afford that. And the constables said, sure you can, because we're going to pay for ourselves. Well, the first thing that happened is Dallas County was covered up with constables doing traffic enforcement, just enraging people. Then, 2 thuggish constables south of town here, and you all saw the news, started seizing cars, putting old people out on the street corner, towing cars. Then you could never find the cars because people who were towing them were felons. And finally the county had to shut it down. What went wrong was we gave these guys not only a commission, but we said your whole payroll depends on snatching money from people. It's never going to work.
There are a lot of examples of agencies being aggressive and even overt in doing forfeitures. Back in 2008, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, known as the ATF, put out a bid to get 2,000 Leatherman tools inscribed with the words, always think Forfeiture. You know, a play on the acronym ATF. So they ultimately pulled that back. But I think it was demonstrative of the fact that they are really pushing their officers at times to do this for the funds.
I have two questions. First for Representative Schaefer. This obviously doesn't do anything about federal law, but in terms of state law, can you remove the moral hazard, if you will, of giving people incentives to do the wrong thing by causing the forfeiture funds to go to the state instead of the jurisdiction that seizes them?
Some states have done that. It goes into the general fund, and that's an option. Ultimately, though, the question that you're going to get is how do you make those departments whole that really were depending upon these funds? And I think that is a legitimate question, that if we're going to talk about changing the standard, removing the incentive that some people see, then let's talk about how to make sure that these agencies are properly funded.
And define whole.
And my second question for whoever wants to field this, I haven't followed this issue, intently. How do the courts deal with the obvious due process violations that are inherent in this whole concept?
I wrote a piece last summer for FreedomWorks. It's called From High Seas to Highway Robbery. It's basically just the history of forfeiture. It explains a lot of that stuff in detail. I don't remember it from off the top of my head. It's not something I regularly speak about, and I did write it like 8 months ago. But I'll be happy if you give me your email address. I'll give you my card, and I'll be happy to email you a copy of it.
I'll give you just an anecdote. The case of the innocent property owner, the example I mentioned where the gentleman owned the truck and had sold it to someone who was making payments, that case made it up to the Texas Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court couldn't get a majority in Texas to hear that case. Justice Willett wrote the dissent on behalf of 2 other justices. So the Texas Supreme Court took a pass on it in a case that to me is really black and white, that the burden ought to be on the state rather than on the property owner in the case of an innocent property owner case.
There was a case in Michigan, I think it was Bennis versus Michigan, and went to the Supreme Court, and it involved a wife who owned a car. Her husband had used it to solicit a prostitute. She was an innocent owner, but the Supreme Court ruled against her because it would be, I don't remember the specifics, but basically they just ruled against her because regardless of her innocent owner claim, the forfeiture was valid under Michigan law. Yeah.
I mean, part of the problem here is that when it's the property itself that's the subject of the suit as opposed to you as an individual, the due process rights get thrown off. Ooh, I don't know if I know the answer to that. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah, it's the object that's on trial.
So there is the structure of the law itself is part of the problem, and I think you just identified it with your question. Absolutely.
Right there. Yes. How would adopting legislation to prevent civil asset forfeiture without due process affect the federal funds that local agencies are receiving through the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration? And what is the relative size of that compared to the funds they're generating at the local level for themselves?
I don't know about the funds at the local level. I can tell you there was a piece that came out last year, and I could be getting it wrong here, but I think there was more taken through forfeiture last year, I think through the equitable sharing program, I think $5 billion, something along that line. Maybe I'm overestimating, but there was more than the total amount that was actually stolen through like burglaries and things like that last year. Interestingly enough, you talk about equitable sharing, the DOJ has actually suspended payments from the program for the year because they don't sequester cuts and other budgetary things have caused them to basically, they're going to wait 10, 12 months, maybe towards the end of the fiscal year to see if they have the money to start the program again. But for now, it's on hold. They're not doing any payments.
I would just, so directly to answer the amount question, from 2001 to 2014, there were 62,000 cash seizures by the federal government with this equitable sharing program. 2.5 billion, 1.7 billion went to state and local, and 800 million went to the federal government. So the scale's large, definitely. I think there's more than one answer. I think James maybe mentioned before that New Mexico had a provision in their law that the state wouldn't engage in this shared equitable sharing, so that you can, as a state, choose not to participate. But secondarily, both of our organizations, actually everybody up here just about, except are working on federal law on this as well. So, I mean, it's not uncommon for our country to be doing things both at the state and federal level that would sort of be working in concert, and I think that's the hope here.
Rumored pieces of legislation, Rand Paul's FAIR Act, for example, it ends equitable sharing, and all the proceeds are sent to the Treasury Department. There are also other pieces of legislation. Chairman Grassley and Chairman Goodlatte are supposedly working on something. We've seen draft bills or heard about the points in the bills, but they haven't been introduced yet. Chairman Goodlatte is probably going to introduce his first. We just don't know when. He's working on a lot of criminal justice reform related stuff right now. I think they're actually marking up a corrections bill either tomorrow or Thursday. Not to get sidetracked, but the one thing I want to point out, though, even if you're talking about federal reform or even state reform, DOJ has not exactly been friendly to this. California was working on a bill that would address equitable sharing. And DOJ actually, in coordination, or appeared to be in coordination with state and local law enforcement, wrote a letter saying basically what happened in New Mexico would happen to you. We would decertify all your participating law enforcement agencies, and you would no longer be able to participate in equitable sharing. You wouldn't receive any funds. It would just go to the state. End of story. What state could do with it, up in the air. But yeah, I mean, they were going to be decertified, and DOJ said as much. So they got involved in local legislation, state legislation.
I think Lawrence was next, and then we'll come back up.
I think it's important that when we're having this conversation about civil asset forfeiture, that we address the financial incentive, because I think it's kind of naive of us to think that there's not a financial incentive. Is it about crime or is it about money? Because we talk about all these reforms. New Mexico passed all these reforms. The governor, through the Senate, through the House. And guess what? The police said, hey, we can't fund our police departments now. And so then they continued to pass these, pull people over, and still were essentially doing forfeitures. And so I think that if we're going to have this honest conversation about criminal justice reform, we have to be honest, conservatives and liberals, and say, hey, it is about the money. It's not so much as stopping crime, because if it was about the law, then it would stop once laws and reforms are put in place. But when you look at New Mexico, who has by far the best civil asset forfeitures laws put in place now, reforms, it still isn't stopping. I mean, it's spread all across, even with those reforms put in place.
My understanding is New Mexico, what's going on there are suspected DUIs, and it's seizure, it's not forfeiture. They're seizing the property, but obviously they can't forfeit it because they have to get a criminal conviction. If they do forfeit under the DUI, I think there's some lawmakers who have filed suit against it, against what the local law enforcement's doing. One thing I want to say, though, you talk about law enforcement in general. I had lunch, or it was a weekend. We were about to watch the Georgia-Alabama game, which to this day still makes me angry. But we were having lunch, and we were talking as a bunch of friends, and one of them is a former state or a former local prosecutor. And she was telling me, she's like, one thing you have to understand about law enforcement, she's like, it's not just the profit motive, it's not just the laws that have given them this. They actually believe, like it is a moral duty for them to fight the war on drugs with as much vigor as possible. And that's their mindset. And you have to understand that too. I mean, they truly believe this. And regardless of whether and there are police who use it honestly, there are police who use it with not honest intentions. But regardless of what you view law enforcement as, they believe this. They believe they're fighting a just cause, and that's something we all should take away from this. Is that this is what they truly believe.
I think you can get. I think we should set the stage for the conversation after the reforms by talking about the small amounts of money seized from a large number of people. To me, that really undermines a lot of the arguments you hear. Do I care if a drug dealer's yacht is being sold for margarita machines even? No, not really, right? Like, who cares? But what we're talking about is a bunch of people who are being stopped and kind of shaken down to some degree. And so if we have to be I think that part of what you're saying about being honest about what's happening now so that we address it fully and we don't just sort of Band-Aid it and have it just keep recurring. I think that's a great point. I think there's a few communications things we can do in particular. And one of them is to really challenge the current usage of civil asset forfeiture. I'm going to read your history of it, because I started reading it and it reminded me of kind of a Scalia opinion, 17th century maritime law was suddenly relevant to my life again. And so but it is where it came from, and it was really designed for these seizures of ships or whatever. So I mean, somebody taking $192 from somebody on the street, to me that's unrelated.
Yeah, it was initially used to enforce tariff laws, and it was actually, I think the British used it against Denmark or something like that, because they were in the middle of a trade war or something like that.
Exactly like a police stop.
Exactly like a police stop, yeah. And it was used sparingly during the Civil War, that it was used during Prohibition, and now it's being used in the war on drugs.
But it raises the issue. You talk about you don't care about the yacht, but when I'm talking about thinking about drug cartels and the havoc they wreak on society and the harm that they cause society, I want our law enforcement officers pursuing that with zeal. But they're going to say, well, you've got the guy that we pull over for, a broken taillight, and he's acting awful funny, and all of a sudden, before you know it, we see that he's got a duffel bag full of, $300,000 in cash. Now, is he just on his merry way, and he's in South Texas, or maybe here on I-20 or I-30? That's real. I want that drug guy to lose his money. I really want him to be hurt. And I don't want to do this in a way that takes that tool away from the law enforcement. But I do think that there's something that we can do that improves the overall standard.
Well, and that's what I want to get to, because
We're heading into primary election season and a series of conventions in the Republican Party. You talked earlier about the fact that the Republican Party itself isn't necessarily warming up to this idea, and I think part of it is ignorance on a lot of people. I think if they're educated, this can change. And of course, we have our own situation that has occurred here in Texas recently down in Waco. There's a couple of gentlemen over here that know a great deal about that, in which there was a bad thing that happened, but there were a lot of innocent people that were basically rounded up and had assets seized. This is a problem. I guess my question for you, Representative, is you've got the beginnings of changes in the law in Texas. You probably got a pretty darn good idea of what sort of law could pass. Is there a gap between what the optimum might be and what we could pass? And I guess what I'm driving at here is we could begin an effort, some of us who are pretty active in the party, we could begin an effort to try to educate convention goers to bring a platform plank or a resolution giving guidance to the legislature about where to go on this matter.
I think that's powerful. Anytime the Republican Party and the activists that attend that convention and go through the platform committee process and say, here's an issue dealing with property rights in conjunction with criminal charges, and we take this position here, legislature, we have spoken on this. There's a group of people that care about it. We're not elected officials, but we are citizens and we want you to do something. That does give us more courage and stiffens our spine a little bit.
What has framed this in a simple, easy to present thing could be given at a precinct convention? If that's what you want, that's what you got to have. About 5 sentences that explain what this is.
the law you would like to pass, we'll take that into a precinct committee.
Actually, I want to get into that. I want to get into all this, because when.
Wait for the microphone here so the, for the folks that are listening.
People in here across the
Right.
country.
People online can't.
The assumption that you have when you talk to people about civil asset I mean property rights, is that of course they're guilty. Of course they're guilty if they have that much cash on them. No normal person carries $16,000 with them across the country on a train. That's what you hear from people in the rank and file. We have Cato on this. We have Heritage on this. We have Institute for Policy Innovation. We have Right on Crime. We have ACLU. We have everybody. FreedomWorks. Everybody's on this. Nobody is able to, as far as I'm seeing yet, craft exactly what you guys are talking about, an actual proposal to stick in the convention process through the party system to push that.
dissent. It is not written in lawyerly terms. It is written in plain language. It's beautifully done. It gives some history and it explains the problem. Justice Willett's dissent on civil asset forfeiture. It's good. Can
we move people past, of course they're guilty.
Just real quick, just for the good of the order, excuse me just a second. We've got about 11 minutes here in our panel, so I kind of want to move to sort of the lightning round portion of the first panel. But just bear in mind, we also have a second panel that's just about policy.
I want to address something that she said in passing, and I don't even think you know how important it is, but you've got cash, you must have done something wrong. Let me tell you, there are a lot of people out there that don't trust banks anymore. Exactly. There are people, if you listen to anybody at the highest levels of the Department of Defense and the National Security Agency, you will learn that cybersecurity is a huge problem. The idea that something could happen with our banks, the idea that something that could happen at the store. How about I just, hey, there are people who may not be here legally. And their only crime that they're committing perhaps is their mere presence in this country because they don't have legal papers for being here, but they go to work every day and raise their kids, and they don't use banks, and they are saving up money to go buy that truck and pay cash for it. There are transactions that happen just because people use cash. That's okay. I don't want you to be in fear because you use cash.
Just real fast, one thing you were talking about rank and file Republicans, and I actually brought a list of polls with me because I'm a data nerd, and one of the polls that was conducted was actually recently in Oklahoma in September of 2015. It actually notes that nearly 70% of likely voters support the legislation to require a criminal conviction before property can be forfeited to the state. It includes strong percentages of Republicans. I actually forgot to put it down for some reason. We're talking 60s, 70s, more than 60 or 70% support legislation that would require a criminal conviction. I have polling out of, there's a YouGov poll, there's a Rasmussen poll, the U.S. Justice Action Network. My friend Jenna is here today from that organization. We partner with them on a lot of this stuff. Right on Crime does as well. They've conducted polling in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and all of it shows 70+%, including high percentages of Republicans. 2/3, 3/4 of Republicans support a criminal conviction requirement before private property is taken by the police. So this is something that once it's explained, because only a quarter of voters even understand what civil asset forfeiture is, we are the 25% basically. But they understand, once you tell them what it is, strong percentages of them support reform. So I think once we present it in the simplest of terms, and I think you guys are right, we have to present it in simple terms.
I need a draft resolution for the precinct conventions 3 weeks from now. That's what I need. It's something that's going to pass.
It's in the platform. I'm looking at it right now.
All right.
Okay. Ma'am, you've been very patient back there. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here. Representative Schaefer, the one thing I'm concerned about what you keep saying is how much should they allow for reasonably in their budget? And my question is, why would it even be in their budget? Why would this money not be treated like a bonus that you may or may not get from your employer? They should budget $0 to take from citizens in this manner, in my opinion. So can you explain that?
I think you can imagine some counties in Texas that perhaps have had tremendous layoffs. Maybe the biggest employer in the county left, closed its doors and left, and the local government is in a tough budget situation. And over time, that local police department has just become to where they've been depending on picking up that cash in order to pay for the maintenance on their vehicles. So I don't think it was by design. All of a sudden one day they said, hey, we're just going to budget this in. But now that they look back at all the money that they've gotten and they've just taken the average and say, hey, over the last 10 years, we've gotten X number of dollars, let's just start projecting that out into the future. So it can happen overnight.
Perhaps that's something that should go into a bill that it can't be budgeted in then. Maybe they could raise funds in the community because that builds great support from the citizens for law enforcement as well.
Okay, so we are at about 7 minutes left with our first panel here, so it's time for the lightning round. Right there in the back, Michael. And bear in mind that this is being webcast, so we really do need you to use them.
Okay, all right. So, Matt, this one's for you because everyone probably in this room wants to see a Republican president next time. Maybe you don't. So where do your candidates stand on this issue?
Oh, let me be really clear. ACLU is not a partisan organization. I'm literally not going to answer that. Yeah, no, pass. Yeah. Those are not my candidates. Yeah, that would be a very gross misdescription. Although I would say the same for the Republicans. So no offense to anyone.
And the gray sweater right there, Michael.
Oh, it's perfect.
A couple of comments on things that you've already said. One about about people not having cash. I got to tell you, over the last 10 years, the preparedness community has blossomed, and there are tons of people that keep lots of cash sitting at home in a safe, and if they travel, they may take it with them. Just trying to take care of your employees if you're a small employer. If it's a problem with the banks, whether it's internal or external threats to the U.S., you don't know what's going to happen. And so you'd like to be able to take care of your employees or the people around you. So a lot of people have cash, and just because they have it doesn't mean people should be able to take it from you.
You're getting into small business stuff. That's a whole other subject with the IRS and structuring laws.
Exactly. But as long as you're claiming it, I mean, as long as it's not like it's cash off the books. What are you talking about? Oh, right. Right. But if you're a really small business, you are the business, you know what I'm saying? So people can take all kinds of things. The other thing is, though, what does the law say about transparency on this? You were quoting some statistics about so-and-so spent this much, they got this much. Where do we find that kind of information? I'm all about educating my friends and family. I'm very, very active in the political community, just in my small little community, and I like to share this. I like to tell people, hey, go look here, look what these people are spending this on. If you don't like it, send your emails, blah, 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 blah. Where do we find that kind of information? Do they have to disclose it? Is that per community? Is it per organization? Or is there a broad law that says you got to tell us what you're doing?
At the local level, every budget should be subject to open records. So at the local level, you can always ask for that information.
So I have to go and ask
Yes,
for it,
ma'am.
and then I've got to write to
Well,
Boston and get them to tell me, because they know they're going to say, oh, file your little form, and then Grapevine does it all the time. They all
Well, you may. I would say that the Office of Court Administration, which is kind of an ancillary group with the Texas Supreme Court, has begun to aggregate some data, and they've got a report coming out this spring. I don't know the level of detail of it, but listen, I think the more we take information that should already be public, aggregate it, and start telling the story, that's definitely somewhere we can start.
I think there's two sources of reporting in Texas, and I will just preview my statements here by saying I think neither is really sufficient. One is the bill that passed last year that has an annual reporting requirement, which I think will be useful. Kind of we can compare apples to apples from place to some degree. And then there's some reporting required through the Attorney General's office that is related to grants. And that was outlined actually in the 2011 legislation. That to me is focused mostly on how the money's spent. I'm actually more concerned about where the money comes from than how it's spent, although how it's spent also matters. So we probably need to strengthen the how we got the money, not the how we spent the money pieces of our reporting, and I would like to see it be just flat out required and posted online so people can just review it. Kind of another of your points is that it is kind of a burden on citizenry to have to kind of go through the whole process of PI. I've been through it as well, so I hear you. So
We
yeah.
have time for one more quick question. Right there.
Well, one question I had was working with a lot of guys, we've heard about an organization called Desert Snow, which does the training of asset forfeiture. And they were just here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So we know our local areas have got more training. I don't know what we can do. I mean, these are former law enforcement agencies, teaming up together to train each other how to do this stuff. We really have to have our legislature stand up for us.
Everybody talks about the legislature, and that's a good place to start. But your district attorney is an elected official. Your county sheriff is an elected official. Your city council, who is the boss of your local police chief, are elected officials. You know, they could make the decision at the local level to say our policy is going to be to require a conviction. They could do that. So these conversations not only need to be happening in Austin, they need to be happening locally as well.
Well, I think, I mean, and I agree with you, yeah, I mean, they can make it a policy, but, you know, anytime we talk, like Eric Holder's policy changes at the DOJ on civil asset forfeiture can be wiped out by the next administration, just by the change of administration, the next attorney general. As far as Desert Snow, I mean, there was a situation in Oklahoma where a prosecutor allowed them to carry out seizures of property, got to keep about 20% of what they took. And they were eventually prohibited. I think a judge actually said the next time he saw the owner of Desert Snow in his courtroom, it would be wearing an orange jumpsuit. So they were held accountable. But things like the Black Asphalt Network and Desert Snow, those are things that lawmakers need to keep an eye on.